It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Eddie Bielawski. We're here in your beautiful home in Netanya. And Eddie, you've written one of the most unbelievable books called The Invisible Jews, Surviving the Holocaust in Poland. I think this book should be in every home because it is a testimony to how your family survived intact. And I'm so privileged to be in your home today. If you could tell us a little bit about your really incredible family.
Thank you. Okay. My name is Eddie Bielawski. I was born in the town of Węgrzów, 70 kilometers from Warsaw and 20 kilometers from Treblinka. It was a town of 16,000 people, of whom 6,000 were Jews. Węgrzów was very convenient for the Nazis because they didn't have to waste trains and trucks to ship us off to Treblinka. They could just do it on horses and wagons. In any case, my father was one of four brothers and a sister. They had a dry goods store, all kinds of notions and things in the center of town. Węgrzów was a market town, and the farmers used to come once a week to sell their goods, and they used to do their shopping there as well. They were considered well off by Polish, Jewish, small town standards because they had a shop and they had a store and they had an apartment to live in. In any case, my grandmother was a very religious woman. My grandfather was a Torah scholar. He was quite well known. He passed away before the war. So my grandmother and my father's siblings ran the store. My father was the oldest son, so he was the only one who married before the war. And we were a family of four. My father was Yitzchak, the oldest son, and my mother was Paula, and my older sister, she was 6 years my senior, called Rini, and then I was born in 1938. My mother actually gave birth to me in Warsaw, but we lived in Węgrzów. She only went to Warsaw to have me. It's kind of interesting that where I was born is now the Ghetto Museum in Warsaw. It used to be a Jewish hospital once upon a time, but that just by the way. In any case, my father was more interested in business than he was in religion, so he became a businessman, and he did reasonably well. He had a lumber yard in Węgrzów. Now, when you think of lumber yard, don't think of America or Canada. It was a small lot with some wood on it. He also had dry goods store, a small dry goods store in Warsaw. And during the summer, he ran a summer resort just outside of Warsaw called Urla. Anyway, all that together, he made a reasonable living. My mother was the daughter of a poor widow. My father is my grandfather. My maternal grandfather passed away when my mother was 2 years old, so she never knew him. And my maternal grandmother remarried a much older man, Mendel Laufer. He was quite wealthy when she married him. He was a buyer of wheat for the Tsar's army. Of course, came the revolution, he lost everything. So my grandmother was married to a much older man who was no longer well off. He was not a bad guy. It wasn't a love marriage, but he wasn't a bad person. Anyway, my father, as I said, made some money, did okay, and things started getting worse and worse and worse in Poland. You know, we heard the news. What I'm telling you now is what I know from my family. I don't remember it. I'll tell you when my memory kicks in. Things were getting worse and worse and worse. And of course, there was no point. People sometimes ask, well, why didn't you leave? Well, those who know anything know very well there was no way to go anywhere. Everything was hermetically sealed. A few managed to slip through the cracks here and there, but basically nobody could move anywhere. My father was smart enough, or lucky enough, to change all his Polish paper money into American gold pieces a couple of weeks before the Polish currency basically became worthless. And that money went a long way towards saving our lives throughout the war. Anyway, things started getting worse and worse. Finally, as you know, in September 39, the Germans came in. Within a couple of weeks, they were in Vengrov. They didn't start murdering people. That wasn't how they did things. They started by reorganizing things and by humiliating Jews, etc. There's one story that's well documented, is the rabbi of the town, Rav Morgenstern. He was a sign of a long line of rabbis. On Yom Kippur, 1939, which means just after the Germans came in, basically, they gathered all the Jewish adults in the center of town, and they told the rabbi, made the rabbi sweep the streets of the horse manure, and then they made him collect it in his shtreimel and put it on his head. And then they stabbed him. The stab wasn't meant to kill him, was meant to hurt him, but the man was a bleeder. Anyway, he bled to death, he died. That was basically the town's introduction to the Nazis.
I think you have a picture of the rabbi in your book.
Yeah. Anyway, these are my two grandmothers. While I have it open here, these are my two grandmothers. And see where I can find, it's earlier. Yeah, this is Rabbi Morgenstern here.
And this happened
He's the one who was
on Yom Kippur.
murdered by the Nazis, yeah. Okay. Anyway.
And here's a picture of your
Yeah.
Your
Here's a
father with
picture
his
of
brothers.
my father's male siblings. From left to right, it's my father Yitzchak, his next brother Feivel, the next brother Rachmiel, and the last brother Moshe. And there was also a sister Menucha. She's not in this picture. Okay, anyway, my father did what he could for us to survive. I think it's worth noting that in around 1940, when it was still possible to travel, he went to Warsaw to see if he could save some of his stock. I mentioned earlier that he had a dry goods store in Warsaw. He had some stock there. He wanted to see if he could save some of it. That was not successful. But he managed to get into the ghetto. The Warsaw ghetto had not yet been hermetically sealed. So he managed to go in there, and he brought food to the Alexander Admor. This is Yitzchak Menachem Danziger. Okay, now our family has a connection to the Danzigers in that my great-grandfather married the Admor's sister. What the family was very proud of her. She was called the Mima Leah, you know, the Aunt Leah. They were very proud of her. As I said, my father was not especially religious. I mean, he was respectful, and he certainly knew. He had a cheder education, so he knew. I won't go into all the details of what my father did or didn't do, because it would take much too long.
But he actually went to bring food to...
He brought food to Danziger, and he gave him a blessing, and he said, Yitzchak, I don't know who will survive this war, but you and your family will survive. Now, if you're a believer, then you accept it as a blessing. If you're not a believer, you can be very jaundiced about the whole thing and say, well, if you weren't here, hadn't survived, you wouldn't be here to tell the story. However, we prefer to believe it was a blessing. In any case, there was my father once, you remember that Poland was divided between the Russian sector and the Nazi sector, and my father and his older brother, his next brother, Fievel, once crossed the Bug. They tried to smuggle something across there, some clothing and I think a barrel of kerosene to try and sell it on the other side. They were caught by the Russians and they were put in prison. And they were there for a couple of weeks. My mother thought for sure they were goners. But my father hid some money in his boot and he called the guard over and he said, tell me, what are we here for? He says, I don't know. He says, how long are we here for? I don't know. He says, who put us in here? Oh, that officer's long gone. So my father thought, he said, tell me, is there a Jewish officer here? A Jewish Russian officer? And the guy said, yeah. So he gave him some money and he brought him and he said, listen, get us out of here. And he did. So he saw that the situation on that side was economically no better than the other side. At least there he knew how to maneuver. Here he didn't. Anyway, they came back. My mother thought that they were gone, but thank God they weren't. Anyway, time went on and things got worse and worse. And what I remember very, very well is this is one of my first memories that I really remember very, very well, was the Germans marching, the Nazis marching into Russia. Now, we had been moved from our original home onto a much smaller place. It was the last house in town, and it was on the main road leading to the Russian front. So the German army, those that were on that road, always went past our house. And I remember so well the Germans, the Nazis, going by there, the trucks and the tanks and the foot soldiers, on and on and on, one after the other. And I remember very well the song that they sang.
Do you still remember it?
It said, hi-li, hi-lo, hi-la, hi-li, hi-lo, hi-la, hi-li, hi-lo, hi-la-la-la-la-la-la-la, over and over and over and over. And I remember, I was excited, you know, I was just a little kid. I saw all these, and boy, when the Germans march, they march. Not like some soldiers, you know, they really do a job. Anyway, I remember my father saying, who is going to stop this machine? Certainly not those peasants, those Russians, they don't even have shoes on their feet. Who's going to stop this? Anyway, things kept getting worse. And my mother said, we need a hiding place. We have to have a hiding place. Well, here we were surrounded by Goyim, by non-Jews. We were in a house without a cellar, without an attic. Where? And my father just didn't know. My mother said, we need a place to hide because things are getting worse and worse. Finally, my father got an idea. He said he dreamt about it. Again, maybe another miracle, I don't know. There are lots of them. There was a shed, a disused shed in the back of the house that people used for storing all kinds of junk. My father went there in the middle of the night and he dug a hole. It took months. He dug a hole about the size of a dining room table, about 5.5, 6 feet deep perhaps, and he had to do it in such a way. He did it in the middle of the night. Remember, this was a rural area. Nobody was up at night. And he used to carry away the buckets and dump them in the field, a bucket at a time. And he went at it, and it took a long time. I didn't know what was going on. I only knew, I couldn't understand why my father was sleeping all day, because I was sleeping at night, so I didn't know he wasn't there. I saw him sleep, but I asked my mother, and she said, no, he's just tired. You know, he wouldn't tell me anything. Anyway, eventually, he got it dug, but also for air, he put in like a drain pipe underground, so there was some air, and that was the only light that there was there. But he had a problem. He had the hole dug, but he needed to put supports in, and to do that, he needed to saw and to bang. And if anybody heard us or saw us, it was the end of it. Anyway, another miracle, if you like, there was a fire in town. And there was clanging and clanging, and everybody's running through town, and he took this opportunity to do all the sawing and all the cutting. He had enough time to do it, and he did it. And he made a trap door, and the trap door was a very, it's a square, a small square, not big enough for us to get through. And he put some earth in it. It was like a little box, very shallow box. He put earth in it and some old tins and stuff, so it wasn't visible. And when he finished, he called my mother in and said, "Can you see an entrance here?" And she looked and she said, "No." So he said, "Okay, it's good." My mother stocked it with hard cakes, I should say, or cookies, very hard ones in tins, so that the rice, the rats and the mice wouldn't eat it up. And she made jam out of beet jam, and some tins of sardines that they managed to get, and some sugar, and a few other small things. I mean, whatever they could get a hold of, they put there. And Yom Kippur, 1942, was the last day that the Jews were together in Vengrove. After that, it was game over pretty much. I should mention that my third uncle, Rachmiel, married in Vengrove during the war. He was the last Jewish wedding in Vengrove. Any case, the day after Yom Kippur, 1942, yelling and screaming and shooting and Shema Yisrael, Shema Yisrael. My parents grabbed us, the two of us, and we dived into our hole there. Now, somebody must have seen something, one of the neighbors, because the very next day, the neighbor brought Ukrainian guards. Now, I don't know if you know anything about the Ukrainians, but I have a lot of trouble garnering sympathy for them. I don't like what's happening to them now. It's a horror. When I think of the Ukrainians during the war, they were monsters. We called them the Black Devils. They were dressed in black uniforms, and they were the hands-on killers for the Nazis. They're the ones that did the dirty work, mostly. Anyway, one of them came in with this neighbor, and he started banging his rifle on the ground, looking for a hollow spot. And again, miracle, he stood on the trapdoor, and he was banging all around. And of course, there was no hollow spot, so they went out. The next day, my maternal grandmother came to us, and she told us that she and her husband, her elderly husband, had been taken, kicked out of their house, and they got half a small room. I remember that as well. It stank, and it was small and dirty, and it was awful. Anyway, Ukrainians came in there and said, "You have to move." And he said, "I'm not moving," and they put a bullet through his head. It's right there and then.
And this was a Ukrainian?
These are Ukrainians did this, yeah. Anyway, my grandmother ran away, and she came to us. There was no room. We were choking as it was. So, we didn't know what to do, And then she said, I have a place to go. I have somebody who will help me. And she went. I think our parents doubted very much that she really had any place to go. But we heard later that she was picked up and taken to Treblinka. There was another story that said that she tried to get off the wagon and they shot her. Either way, either she went in Treblinka or on the way to Treblinka. Anyway, there we were underneath in this ground, in this hole. And we all learned very, very quickly to talk in whispers, because when you whisper, your voice doesn't carry. When you talk like this, you can't hear anything, right? So we all learned to talk like that, and that's how we spoke all through the war. I never cried. I never complained. I suspect that a child will cry if he thinks he can get something. If he yells loud enough, his parents will get him whatever he wants. But maybe when there's nothing to be had, maybe there's nothing to cry about. Any case, that was okay, and then I developed a cough. Now that's something you can't control. I didn't know what to do here. Somebody heard us coughing, that was the end of us. Anyway, my father opened the trap door and found an egg. Now, there were some chickens running far away, but there's never been anybody there or any chickens there. Anyway, he took the egg in, and we had some sugar, and my mother made a concoction of sugar and egg. We used to call it a goggle-moggle. Anyway, I drank it, and my cough went away. And another miracle, maybe. Anyway, time went on. We were there 5 weeks. We ran out of food completely. Where do you get food? Water my father got because he went out at night and he filled a bucket. We had 2 buckets there. One was the latrine and the other one was water. So he went out at night and he got water, but food, there's no food. Don't know what to do. We're starving. And let me tell you something. The starvation is something absolutely nobody can understand. It has nothing to do with hunger. I mean, being hungry is nothing. You're hungry, you come home, you eat. You're not hungry. Even Yom Kippur, where people don't eat one day, by the end of the day, everybody's green, one day. But when you're in a position where you have no food, and you don't know where your next meal is coming from, or even if there's going to be a next meal, it's a completely different problem. Any case, they came up with a plan. They'd send my sister out to buy bread. Not a great idea, but the only possibility. I was too small, and my parents were known in town, so they couldn't go. So my sister went, and it wasn't hard to spot her as a Jew either, because she was emaciated and white compared to the ruddy, chubby Polish girls. Anyway, one Polish girl came to her and said, "I know you're a Jew. Give me your money or I'll tell the Germans." So she was smart enough to give her half the money. And she went to the bakery and she managed to get a loaf of bread. And she came back. Well, how long does a loaf of bread last, even on small rations? But we made it last a week, and then we're starving again. See, well, it worked once, maybe it'll work again. By this time we'd been underground for 7 weeks, in our living grave, basically. My sister went out, and she went to the bakery, and they told her they don't sell bread to Jews. They wouldn't give her any bread. So she came back, and I guess one of the neighbors saw her going in or whatever it is, and she came and she found us, and she started screaming and yelling, "Get out of here," and on and on and on. My father said, "Just let us stay here till it's dark. We'll leave. Just let us stay here till it's dark." And she was all hysterical. We stayed there for a short while, and my father said, "Let's get out of here." Now, my father, as I told you, he had his gold coins, and he sewed them onto my legs and on my wrists. And he picked me up on his back in a sheet, the way you see Ethiopians sometimes carrying their kids, that kind of thing. And off we went. We went a short while, and we found the root cellar, and we went down into the root cellar, and we were there till dark. When it got dark, we got out of there, and we didn't know where we were going. We headed into the forest. We walked into the forest. Now remember, this is November in Poland, and it's cold. We were walking through the forest, and a bunch of Polish robbers came upon us. He said, "Give us your money." Everybody knows Jews have money, right? So my father says, "I haven't got any." So they searched my father and my mother, my sister, of course. They didn't find anything. They thought I was a package or something, so they touched me, and I started to wiggle. They saw I was a baby, so they left me be. But they took my father's boots. So there was my father in November in a Polish forest with no shoes, no boots. And probably the only time in the war that I remember that my father just sort of gave up. He says, I just can't walk anymore. They walked and walked and walked for a while, wherever, and couldn't continue. His feet had turned blue. Anyway, my mother saw some smoke coming from a chimney there. So my mother could pass for a Pole. She spoke Polish beautifully, and she didn't look especially Jewish. My father, on the other hand, was almost a caricature of a Jew, you know. He could have, no way, he was short with a big nose, you know, the works. So my mother went, and she said, look, we're Jews, we're here, and we need some help, we can pay. So he agreed, okay. So we came there, and I remember I had milk and honey, hot milk and honey. It was absolutely heaven. It was the best thing I ever had in my whole life. And we got some food, and my father managed to get a pair of boots, much too big for him, but I remember he packed them with straw so they would fit. He was a small man. And we were there for a day, and then he said, listen, Germans are coming out. We said, where? He said, I don't care, out. So my mother and I went one side, and my sister and my father went into the forest, the other side. And I remember sitting beside a pond. It was a beautiful, beautiful November day, and my mother had a kerchief on like a peasant, Polish peasant woman. And I said to my mother, why couldn't we just be cows? They leave the cows alone. Why don't they just leave us alone? And my poor mother started to cry. What could she do? Anyway, with nightfall, we went back to the house, to the farmer's house. And my sister and my father were not there, so my mother thought that was it. But a couple of hours later, they showed up. They just went a lot further than we did. Anyway, he said, I don't want you here. My father had an address. We tried a place there. They threw us out. They wouldn't have anything to do with us. Finally, he said that he had a cousin who might keep us. So we were there. He did for a lot of money, but he kept us in a barn there. And he gave us minimal food, whatever it was. While we were there, we heard through him that there was an order from the Germans, from the Nazis, that the killing is over. The Jews should come back to Węgro, and you'll work and be no more killing. But any Jew caught outside of Węgro will be shot on sight. So I think this was probably the most important decision my father had to make during the war. I don't know the most important, but one of the most important. And he said, no, I don't trust them. I'll take my chances outside. Now, I should mention that my father's siblings and Rachmiel's wife, I said he married her before, had made a hiding place in the attic of the store. Now the brothers were very handy. They could do almost anything with their hands. And they built like a double wall. This is a system we were to use later on. He made a double wall in the attic there. And here, I don't know if you can make sense of this, but this is the double wall. It's very hard to see because it's black and white. There was a door here, you see, like bricks.
Yeah.
It looked like the rest of the wall, only there were hinges on the end there, and you could open it and they would go inside and close it. So even if someone went up to the attic, which no one had any reason to go to, they would be safe. Anyway, they came down from the attic and they were pretty much left alone. My uncles got a job working, you know, there was such a thing as preferential workers that the Germans needed for certain jobs. There was a Jewish dry cleaning establishment called Kreda, and it was the only one in town, and was the only one that knew how to clean Germans' uniforms. So my uncles and my aunt kind of got a job working there, and they got papers from the German government that they were essential workers, which means that they could move around. Anyway, this went on for a while. So how did we know this? Is that we kept in touch through the farmer where we were. He used to go into town once a week, so we sent a letter to them and brought a letter back, and this was how we kept in touch. We knew what was happening. This went on for a while until the Germans came and they wanted a Pole to learn the business, and we understood very well what that meant. It means at the end, right? If the Poles can handle it, they don't need you. So my uncle Fievel, he was basically in charge there because he was the oldest brother of that faction, if you want to call it, said that I have no place for our mother to be, this is my grandmother, and you absolutely must find a place for her. So my father said, okay, bring her. So she came with my youngest uncle, with Moshe. She came with him, okay?
And you remember, you have memories?
Oh yeah, that I remember very well. Anyway, we hid them in the barn. We didn't even tell the farmer they were there. So, our meager rations had to be shared out that much more. Anyway, things got worse and worse. And then all the others came running to us. They knew where we were. So my other uncle and the third uncle with his wife, and the sister didn't come, and we didn't know what happened to her. She came a day later. She had been shot when she was running away, and she pretended she was dead. It was it was a flesh wound. It went right through her, and she came to us wounded, and we cleaned her up as best my father did that actually. He cleaned her up with some water that they warmed under their armpits. Anyway, you can't hide 10 people. So went to the farmer and said, look at the situation. He said, I'm not keeping 10 people. He said, you know what? Don't keep us. We'll make a hiding place, an underground hiding place outside there, with nothing to do with you. All you have to do is supply food, and we'll pay you, and you don't know anything about it. Okay? So we were there for a while, but then it was impossible. It couldn't be. He didn't want. So we found a rich farmer, rich by those standards, and he was willing to take us for a price. So we went there, and some of us went to stay with his sister. Not some of us, some of my family, but he didn't want me. He was afraid of me because I was a small child. If I started to cry at the wrong time, we were dead. He didn't want us. So my father and I went back to the old place, and we stayed there. But we stayed in the back room. There's a small back room there, and they had a good time relatively for that, because he was a farmer who had milk and he had butter, and so they had food. This farmer was poor, and we didn't have very much, but we were almost starving, but not quite. Also, while we were there, my father made a hiding place. He took a board out in the kitchen, and he dug like a trench, so that if anybody came, company, especially Sunday, we could dive down there, and he just covered the board. So I would sit down there with my father while he had company. While we were there, my father was very good with his hands, made little toys for me. I remember one that he made was like 2 sticks and a little man, and 2 holes through the little man, and you wound it up and you pulled it so it turned, so that was great. Another time he made, this I remember well, he made a rifle. He carved a rifle for me out of a piece of wood. And when we came up, we saw that the farmer was also making a rifle for his son, because he had a son older than I, but still a child, a young boy. And his rifle turned out all crooked, and he got all upset and he threw it into the fire. And my father quickly grabbed the rifle out of my hand and handed it to him. And I understood that the last thing we wanted to do was to upset this guy. Anyway, the other farmer got cold feet finally, and he said out. And same thing with us, all kinds of things happened in between. I can't go into all the details. And we went to somebody else, a farmer that my parents knew, and he was probably the only really decent human being we met among the Poles. He let us stay up in his loft, and he actually fed us, and he refused to take money. He said, what's happening is wrong. He was an older man. Of course, my parents paid him. He didn't want, but they insisted. We couldn't stay there though, because it was in the open, and there were children running around. We would be seen. We couldn't. So my mother and my uncle, my second uncle, Fivel, went looking for a place. They heard maybe somebody would take it. We went out there, and they found a farmer called Bielawski, and he agreed to let us build a hole on his ground, on his land. So we did, and we were down in that hole. We were there for a while, and there was he built wheat sheaves over the opening, so that when we came out among the sheaves. Anyway, it started to rain, and the whole thing collapsed, and we came out, and my uncle Moshe was the last one out, and he had a green beret which ran, or was black I think, and it ran, but his hair turned green, and we started to laugh. We stood there laughing. I'm sure we looked like something out of an insane asylum, because there we were, emaciated, filthy, disgusting, and we were laughing because Moshe had green hair. Anyway, what do we do next here? Okay, we don't have a hole anymore. So my father and the brother said, look, if we make a hiding place in your barn that you can't find, would you let us stay? He said, yes. He said, okay, give us all these materials and disappear for a few hours. So they went up to the attic of the barn. There were animals downstairs, and they cut off a piece of wall, and they made it look very old. It was a long attic. It made it look old from the outside, so that somebody looking from there couldn't see anything. And the entrance was through the floor, up a ladder. You pull the ladder up, right? So all of us went up to the top, except my two uncles, my father and his brother, sorry. And the farmer came in and he says, where are we? He said, we're here. So he looked here and he looked there, he looked up in the attic. He says, I can't find you. So we told him where we were, and they said, okay, he agreed. Anyway, I'm going to go all the details, but we sat there for a year in that hole. Our only light were two small holes in the round holes. Actually, I have a picture of it, a painted picture. Would you like to see it? But you have to stop it for a second. Okay. This was painted from my father's memory in 1947, beginning of 1947. We stayed here in this barn. Actually, we were on this side, right? You see the two little holes here, but we're actually on this side. This is the farmhouse, and this is where he kept his wheat and hay, etc., etc. So we spent a year here in this small area here like this. Only went out once that I remember. That was during, can I put it down? That was during Christmas. We were invited to the farm there, and we had some food. Outside of that, we were there all the time.
And you didn't go out at night, or?
My father did. They went down the ladder sometimes, and they walked around. There were horses there, and they cut off pieces of the horse's tail and they made brushes out of it. I have one here. Would you like to see it?
Very much. So this is from the horse's tail?
Horse's tail. They went down at night and cut off a piece of horse's tail, and they made things out of it. And this is the only thing of my father's that I have that survived from that period. Okay, have you seen it?
It's amazing.
Yeah. Anyway, we were there, and there were plenty of days we were starving when he was out in the field. He didn't come back. You know, he forgot a couple of days. He didn't bring us anything. We get basically one loaf of bread a day, and we divided it among 10 people. Well, 8 adults and 2 children. Boredom was a terrible problem because, you know, you just sit there and nothing to do. Also, I don't know how we survived the Polish winters with no heat, with no real clothing, but we survived. We're here. Anyway, my parents taught me to read and to write and arithmetic, and there was nothing to do, so I was really the pet there for the whole area. Anyway, we heard that the war is coming to an end. I'm making it short. I mean, a year doesn't go in a minute, but
can I just ask you, while you're in the barn, did you ever come out during the day, or did you see the sunlight, or?
We saw sunlight through the hole.
But you couldn't come out.
When it became dark, that was it. There was no light in there. No fire was allowed in there, and no kind of light. That was it. The end of the day was the end of the day. We were in the dark. This is the way it was. And only once I remember an owl came in and put his head in there, and I'd never seen an owl before. And my father wanted to say, "Look at that," and I screamed because I thought it was a flying cat or something. I'd never seen anything like this. In any case, I was the pet there. They taught me to read and write, etc., etc. Anyway, we heard that the Russians are coming, and our farmer ran away. And we saw Germans retreating, and as our bad luck at the time would have it, they brought a cannon to the bottom of the barn there. They put a cannon there. And what are we to do? We're on top there, and the Nazis there with a cannon. So the brother started to, what should we do? What should we do? He says, you know, we had a couple of small hatchets there, so maybe we'll go down and at night. And it's ridiculous because there was, you know, these little emaciated Jews are going to take on, you know, the veterans of the Russian campaign, you know, fat chance. Anyway, just didn't know what to do. Anyway, the Russians kept coming, and the German officer said, we have to leave. And as they were pulling the cannon out, he said, "Aufreißen." Aufreißen means blow it up. Anyway, they didn't have time. The Russians came, and we saw the Russians coming. And
if they would have blown it up, they would have blown up where you were staying.
Yeah, with us on top of it, of course.
But it's another miracle. It's because
many just miracle
many
after
times
miracle after
when
miracle.
they retreated, they did blow up. They did destroy.
Yeah, but you know, I have my own problems with miracles because I say it's true. These were all miracles, but then I say, where are the other 6 million miracles? You know, I mean. Anyway, we waited a few days. And when we heard that the Russians were firmly in control of Vengrov, we went back. We somehow dragged our ways back. I mean, we looked like something out of hell, basically, which we were. We were emaciated and dirty and filthy and lousy and sick, and you name it, we had it. But I must say that the Russian army was okay with us. We went to a Russian soup kitchen, and they fed us with what they had. Now, this is not the American army, this is the Russian army. They had potatoes and beets, you know, that was it, and some bread, and that's what they had. But they shared, so that was fine. Anyway, we went back to town.
And Eddie, you had on your back a cyst that you were
coming to that. We came back to town. I had developed a cyst on my back, and we settled somehow. The Russians gave us a place there, and I had a cyst on my back, and my mother took me to a Polish hospital, and they drained it, and I was thin. I couldn't talk. All I could do was whisper. I'd lost my voice completely. But within a couple of days, it was back again. So my mother took me back to the hospital, and they said, I'm too weak, they can't do anything, they can't drain it anymore. So my father went to a Russian military hospital, a red military hospital, and he asked for a Jewish doctor, and where don't you find a Jewish doctor, right? So I found one. They're not allowed to work on civilians. This is a military hospital. But he said, I'll do it, and he operated on my back with no anesthetics, just put some vodka or whatever he put on it, you know, and cut me open and bandaged me up.
Do you recall? Do you remember?
Oh, yes. And I went home, and he said either I'll live or I won't, you know, but that's it. There was no other way. So I was in bed for months, and it was pussy, but eventually, obviously, it healed. Took a long time. There's also another side story there. My mother, when we first came there, my mother went to a Polish woman to whom she had entrusted all our bedding and blankets and all the goods, and she wanted something because we didn't have anything. And she was trapped there by a drunk German, by a drunken Russian. She was trapped there by a drunken Russian who said, I know you, you're the one that was shooting at us from the church. My mother said, what are you talking about? We're Jews, we're waiting for you to come. He said, no, you're it, you know. Anyway, my mother was there, she was begging him, didn't help. My father saw she wasn't coming back. So he went to the Russian headquarters, and he asked again for a Jewish officer who took another soldier with him, and they went there. And the guy would have shot my mother, probably would have raped her and shot her. Anyway, they arrested him, and they let my mother go. And the woman there said, I had nothing to do with this, I don't know anything about it, which is rubbish. She's the one that invited him. My mother said, I don't want anything, just leave me be. You have to understand that we were afraid of the Poles. We were as afraid of the Poles as we ever were, because they had all been, not all, many of them had been complicit in the murder of Jews, and they sure didn't want the story to get out. We were the only Jews in town, our family, were the only ones that came back at that time. There are a few others, that stragglers, that came back afterwards. But we had Russian soldiers sleeping in our house to protect us from the Poles. We were doing them a favor because we gave them a place to sleep, but they were doing us a favor because they protected us from the Poles. And we were there. Now remember that we were freed before the war was over because we were in eastern Poland. So we were there before the Battle for Warsaw. The Battle of Warsaw was after us. So we waited until that was over. We actually saw the ghetto burning. The Goy told us that the ghetto was burning. It was before that. Anyway, after the war, we left Vengrov. We left at night because we were afraid of the Poles. They wouldn't let us go because they didn't want people spreading stories as they tell us now. You know, the Poles are all innocent. They had nothing to do with anything. Anyway, from there we went to a town called Bytom, and we lived there for a year or so. One story worth mentioning. My grandmother lived in Lodz. She moved there with the other siblings, and she died there. And I went with my mother to the funeral. I didn't actually go to the funeral, but I went to Lodz with my mother. On the way to Lodz, our train was stopped, and some Polish partisans, whatever they were, pulled 8 Jews off the train and shot them. My mother said, I just sat there quietly. I was a very blonde kid, so I could pass.
I'm just going to show a picture of you. You were very blonde.
Yeah, yeah.
And this was a picture of your mother. You have also a picture of your mother, and your father was very dark. He looked very very
wasn't
Jewish.
very dark,
but he looked Jewish.
He was very Jewish looking. I mean, no way he was anything else but what he was. As you can see, my mother
Here's a picture of your father.
Especially, yeah. Anyway, I was.
And do you remember on the train seeing the Jews being taken off?
We were there, and my mother goes like this, and I knew about keeping quiet. You know, I was never a child. I never had a child. I always had to watch my back. I always had to watch what I was saying and to whom I was saying it. While we were in Bytom, I went to grade 1 in Polish school, and they didn't know I was Jewish. And I even went to church on Sundays. Of course, I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly to keep my mouth shut. And I know when you went into a church there, you were supposed to cross yourself with the holy water. I never touched the holy water. That was my protest. You see, I never touched it. And once Jewish kids came into our school, and I could see he was Jewish, you know, dark hair. And then I said, "Are you Jewish?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Keep your mouth shut, or you won't last here." And of course he didn't. And they beat the hell out of him. And that was his first and last day at the school. That was my little Polish friends. Anyway, my father went to Vienna ahead of us, and he set up, you know, got a place to live, etc., etc. And my mother, my sister, and I followed. We went through Bratislava, through Slovakia, and we spent 2 years in Vienna, and from there we moved to Canada.
Can I just ask, when you saw your father, I think it must have been very emotional, but I think you told your father about his mother.
Yes, I did.
And your mother was very upset with you.
I said, you couldn't wait, you know, as soon as we landed. My mother didn't want to tell him before that. They were writing, but she didn't want to tell him because she was afraid that he would be put in his head to come back, and didn't want him to come back.
And it was very difficult to leave. It was not communist.
Yeah, it was a whole story getting out too. It wasn't a simple thing. You know, it's till you got out of there, and like with false papers and funny papers and paying, and it was a whole...
But seeing your father again, it must have been very emotional.
Oh yeah, of course. I hadn't seen him for a while, but he set up, you know, a place for us to be, and we stayed there for a while. Just you might find something interesting here from Vienna. While we were in Vienna, we rented part of an apartment. We shared it with some Austrians because living space was hard to come by. You know, a lot of the city was destroyed. Anyway, we had learned during our stay there that the woman was a convert. She was Jewish. She was born Jewish, and she was a convert. But she converted way before the war. It wasn't because of the war. It was quite a phenomenon in Vienna for the Jews to convert. It was not new. Anyway, when we left for Canada, she gave my mother a present. It was a siddur that she got, and it says here in German, it says unsere Elsa. Elsa was her name, our Elsa, and 1906. And it was printed in 1904 in Vienna.
And she kept this.
She kept it. That's the whole point, you know, that how dangerous it was to be caught with a book like this. It's, you see, it's an Orthodox Siddur, but it's Gothic German and Hebrew.
Can I see it? And it's got an inscription and with velvet.
Yeah, the inscription. Yeah, there was
1906.
I don't know if you can see it. It's a bit faded. It was written in 1906, so yeah.
And she was married to a non-Jew.
Yeah, he was a piece of garbage, pardon the expression. He was a drunken bum. He used to beat her. He was a horrible, horrible person. Anyway, from there we went to Canada, and from Canada I met my wife Elaine, and we were married, and we came to Israel in 1968 with a 15-year-old daughter.
This is the ship that you went on. I think you had to wait a long time for the ship to come to take you to Canada.
Oh yeah. No, there's a lot of stories in between, but you know, I mean, there's a limit to.
And this is a picture of your parents.
Yeah.
They were really tremendous heroes. They were.
You know, one of my jokes to my kids is, you know, when I came to Canada, they put me in grade 1 because they didn't know any English. And they gave me a test, like, to see if I knew any math. And they gave me, like, numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, with a line underneath. And I looked at this, I said, what do they want from me? And surely they don't want me to add this up because that's too stupid. I knew addition, subtraction, multiplication, and long division, and what they want from me. So I didn't answer it. So obviously I knew no English and no math. So I say in grade 1, I tell my grandchildren that your grandfather is a genius. He spent 3 years in grade 1. I spent grade 1 in Poland, grade 1 in Vienna, and grade 1 in Canada.
And
anyway.
Eddie, when you came to Canada, how old were you when you arrived in Canada?
Almost 10.
Almost 10.
Yeah.
And was it difficult? I don't think you knew English at that time. Or was it difficult for you to make friends, to be integrated into the school?
Not really. It was, look, I learned English very quickly. I mean, there were some funny stories with the English too, because my mother's half-brother, that's the person who brought us over, was a very simple man, and their English was atrocious. You know, they spoke very old country English. And they had 4 daughters. One of the daughters was called Shirley, and her mother called her Shoily. So I asked her in Yiddish, is her name Shirley or is it Shoily? So I figured the mother should know, right? So she said Shoily. So I called her Shoily. And then they straightened me out. They said, no, just the way she talks, you know, it's Shirley. But there are all kinds of little things like that.
I think this family that brought you out to Canada, they weren't wealthy, and I think he took a loan. And
they weren't. But my father had money. He made money before the war and during the war. Not during the war, after the war. And he paid them back every penny, plus interest. I mean, he paid for it. But fair is fair. They didn't know that.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't know that when they brought us.
And you have such a wonderful picture of you with your sister.
Yeah. Yeah.
And moving to Canada, people ask you, and how come your family didn't decide to come to Israel in those days?
Nobody asked us that, but I'll tell you this: we did not get a very good welcome in Canada.
You didn't?
The Jews were not happy to see us. They didn't want to hear anything as to what happened. My father ever tried to talk to them. They covered their ears. And one of those people I remember very well saying, "Oh, what are you doing here? I thought they got you all." And after that, my father just would not talk.
Was this a non-Jew who said that?
No, these were Jews. These were Jews.
Somebody said, I thought they got you all.
Yeah. I don't know whether, I guess partly they were ashamed of us because, you know, we didn't speak English, and people would, you know, they were already Canadian. They weren't very Canadian. Their English was atrocious. They had no education. I'm talking about the older generation, not their kids and grandchildren. Maybe they were afraid they would lose their jobs to us. I don't know, but they were not happy to see us.
You weren't so welcomed?
No, we weren't welcome. But my father was a man who didn't worry about stuff like that. Within a few years, he opened a business, and he did quite well and made some money. I mean, didn't become very wealthy, but certainly we were okay. Unfortunately, he passed away at 53. He died only after 11 years in Canada. Mm-hmm. But still, he left my mother and us taken care of. Like, we weren't going to starve. We weren't wealthy, but we were not poor. So, anyway.
And Eddie, can I ask, when you were at school, did any of the kids ask you where were you born, or what happened during the war, or was anybody interested in hearing your story?
Sometimes I'd make up some stories, you know. It was, I thought that the kids were stupid. They weren't. They were normal, bright Jewish kids who grew up under very different circumstances. So, you know, they spoke about, oh, he's a commie, you know, communist. And I said, well, so what? You know, like, I told you I was never a kid. I never had a childhood, because even when I was a kid, I wasn't a kid. You know, I always knew I had to watch what I say and how I say it and to whom I say it, and I never talked out of turn. I always thought very carefully before I said anything. Anyway, My wife Elaine was, very much a Canadian girl who'd never been to Israel, and she agreed to come with me, although she'd never been here before.
And what made you want to come to Israel?
I always wanted to come to Israel. Since I was a kid, I just felt that this is where I belonged, and I still feel that. Canada was a wonderful country. If I didn't want to be in Israel, I wouldn't be anywhere else. It isn't like I didn't run away from Canada. I came to Israel. Not the same thing.
Yeah, it's very different.
And I must give credit to my wife that she came on my say-so. And I believe she's been quite happy here. It was 55 years ago. It's not a day. No.
And Eddie, I have to ask you, you wear a kippah and you're very involved in the shul here. Were you always traditional, or did you always have emunah? Because what you went
through, question
I
now.
know, it's very difficult.
My mother always lit candles. She came from, religious home. My father kind of gave it up. I have a lot of trouble with religion too. I have trouble with God. Whenever anybody tries to, doesn't happen very often, but once in a while somebody tries to explain the Holocaust and why it happened, as far as theology is concerned, I can't buy anything anybody says. The best I've heard is, we don't know. That's the best answer I've heard. There are all kinds of bitter Jewish jokes about Holocaust survivors, people have heard these, and not original, but one was that in one of the concentration camps they put God on trial and they found him guilty and said, now let's daven Mariv. Okay. Another one, that's enough, anyway.
But what made you, you involved in the shul here, you were a kippah?
Because this is our story, this is who we are, and this is where Jews come together to do Jewish things. Look, I'll be very honest, I have trouble praying. I say the words, we keep kosher, keep Shabbat, all that's honest, but I have trouble praying. I don't have trouble reading it, I have trouble
I understand.
praying. I don't know how anybody else feels. I'm not in anybody else's skin, but yeah.
And if I can ask you, because what you've gone through it's unbelievable that I think your family is it's unique that nearly the entire family intact survived the Shoah in Poland. It's very unique. It's very, very special.
Well, I told you, I don't know of another family where 10 people survived as a unit. People survived in Russia, a number ran away and they managed.
And being so close to Treblinka, you were...
Yeah, it was 20 kilometers. It was next, very close to Treblinka.
So if I could ask you, what message do you give to the future generations, to your own family, to...
Well, in my opinion, one, we must never forget, ever. Secondly, sometimes I feel that the Germans, the Nazis, the Germans now, I guess I mean, by admitting total guilt, have let the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, all the others off the hook. Because what do you want from us? They did it. They even admitted that they did it. If the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, and all the others there had not cooperated with the Nazis, they could not have done half the job that they did. I'm not even talking about helping. I can kind of understand not wanting to help Jews, whom you don't like anyway. You've never liked Jews. They've been very anti-Semitic there forever. So I can understand not helping Jews, but there's a long way between that and selling out a Jew for a kilo of sugar. Okay, so I see the Poles refusing to take any responsibility whatsoever. They tell a half a story, and as you know, a half a truth is a lie. Yeah. They say, what do you want from us? We were attacked by the Germans, by the Nazis. True. We fought. True. We lost. True. They built concentration camps in Poland. True. So what do you want from us?
Yeah.
You see, this is their story. They're not going to tell you that they were bad guys. We suffered too, you know. It's all true. They did suffer. What has it got to do with what they did to us? Anyway,
So I just want to thank you.
Okay.
And I think this is incredible. The book that you've written,
Yeah.
Eddie, this is incredible. This is the most amazing book. I know you haven't been back to Poland,
No.
but somebody did go back and they actually managed to find
Yeah.
the attic,
My cousin.
your cousin, and they actually found
Yeah.
the
They
tin
found
of
that. I told you that
provisions that
in
were...
my grandmother's house, they built a double wall up in the attic, and nobody ever found it. And there was some guy some professor, somebody doing research on this, and he read. My uncle wrote a book. You know, it was kind of anyway. And they found that this mentioned in it, so they wanted to see if it was really true. They had to break in through the roof. They got permission, and they found the thing completely intact.
And
You see, and they found all this inside. This is a fish and a lamp and a jar and
And this is when you were in there, and this is 75 years later.
yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, your book, The Invisible Jews, it is surviving the Holocaust in Poland. It is something that I read it, and I would recommend everybody to read it, because it is so not only inspiring, but it's just harrowing, but it's also miracles. It really is. And your story is just unbelievable, and you are amazing, and I'm so grateful to you. And you should just have mazel and bracha.
Thank you.
And
You as well.
it's wonderful, and I so appreciate this. It's been a true honor and a privilege. Really, thank you so very, very much.
Okay.
This is your book, The Invincible Jews, and it's in Czech.
Yeah, it's in Czech. The Czechs phoned me. Somebody from publishing house asked if they could have permission to have it translated and printed in Czech. So I said yes. Okay, there it is.
And they made it into hardcover.
Yeah.
Well, I think it should be translated into all the different languages.
Yeah, well, somebody will do it.
Anyway, thank you so much, Ian.
Okay.